Coming in dead last is Saint Anger. This album is an abomination. A disgrace to metal. There is not a single song I enjoy on this album, which is why there is no song in the background. Horrible compression, the worst snare I've ever heard, and the most cringy and edgy lyrics ever. Up next is 72 Seasons. This is probably one of the most generic but rock albums I've ever heard. The songwriting is boring, the production is boring, the singing is boring, the guitar solos are boring, the drumming is boring, and this album in general is boring. This is a serious contender for most boring, generic album of the year. Hardwired is slightly better, but it is still very generic and boring. The only slightly above average song on this album is Spit Out the Bone. Besides that, the production is boring, vocals are boring, and so on. This was a massive downgrade from Death Magnetic. Next up is Reload, and this is already 100 times better than the previous three. This album has a lot of filler, but Devil's Dance, Where the Wild Things Are, Fixer, and Unforgiven 2 are some of the best Metallica songs. This album, though, is mostly forgotten filler from Load. They should have gotten rid of the filler and just combined Load and Reload into one album. Overall, this album is fine. Next up is Load, which started Metallica's dive into mediocrity. This album is very generic post-grunge. This album is much more consistent than Reload, but it doesn't have as many high points. Most of the songs on here are very forgettable and boring. It does have a few great songs, like Until It Sleeps, King Nothing, and The Outlaw Torn. Overall, it's a good album, but it could have been a lot better if not for all of the filler tracks. The Black Album was Metallica's first breakthrough into the mainstream. It is also the most sold metal album of all time. This album strays away from Metallica's thrash metal sound and ventures into a more accessible sound. Their biggest hits such as Enter Sandman, Wherever I May Roam, Nothing Else Matters, and The Unforgiven are on this album. While I do like the songs, this album is pretty bland and unimpressive in my opinion. I've heard worse. I've heard better. This is the middle of the road for Metallica. Kill 'Em All was Metallica's first album, and it is credited as the first thrash metal album. While I do like this album, and it's one of the more consistent albums, it just doesn't hit as much for me. Songs like Whiplash, Seek and Destroy, and Metal Militia are really great thrash metal songs, but I don't find myself coming back to this one very often. Bet you guys didn't expect Death Magnetic to be number 4 after I bashed their last 2 albums. I think, aside from the overcompression, low bass, loud kick drum, and low vocals, that this is a really great album. Songs like Unforgiven 3, That Was Just Your Life, and Suicide and Redemption are really good songs. Besides, if you search up this YouTuber, you can find a better produced version of the album. The songwriting on this album felt less bland than the 2 after it. Number 3 is Injustice for All. This album would be the greatest thrash metal album of all time, if not for the absolutely horrendous production. The bass is inaudible, the guitar tone is scooped, the kick is clicky, and the snare is dry. Besides that, the writing on this album is great. Lars' drumming is better than ever on this album. The songs are proggy and technical. The riffs are complex and difficult. Overall, this is an amazing album that's held back by poor production choices just like Death Magnetic. Second place is Master of Puppets. This album is widely considered one of the best thrash albums of all time, but personally, I just don't listen to it as much as the album before it, which I will get to next. Songs like Damaging and the title track show off Metallica's technical riffs. Orion shows off Cliff's great bass playing and Kirk's great solos. Nothing shows off Lars' good drumming, because you can't present something that doesn't exist. Overall, this album is great, but some songs, at least in my opinion, are a little too long and drawn out. This is also the case for Death Magnetic Injustice. My number 1 favorite Metallica album is Ride the Lightning. There are absolutely no skips for me on this album. This album is filled to the brim with amazing solos, and the production never felt like a downside despite the heavy reverb. I can always go back to this album and never be bored with it. This is one of my favorite thrash metal albums, and for good reason. I never understood why people put Master of Puppets above this. I find this album to have much more replayability. Overall, this is just a fantastic thrash metal album. A huge improvement on Kill 'Em All. This also has my favorite album cover from Metallica. This album has their best ballad as well. You can't go wrong with Ride the Lightning.